When Bashar became the president of Syria, there was quite a bit of optimism because something we call the Damascus Spring came about, and that was the belief that this man, a Western educated physician, who originally, as I said, was not supposed to be in this as the president of Syria, perhaps he would be more willing to open up and be a different leader than his father was. So the Damascus Spring was something analogous to the glasnost in Soviet Union under Gorbachev. There was more freedom and lots of hope for change, freedom for the press, and the entire environment, the atmosphere, the ambiance had an air of change in it. Unfortunately for Syria, the opening did not last very long. It lasted about 8 months. After that, we went back to the old regime, the old rule, and the old control system. Why? Probably, this is a kind of a speculation on my part, Bashar was pressured by the ruling elites, seeing the danger in opening up, and the danger was that they could lose control had they continued to liberalize, and if that had happened, then people's sense of efficacy, political efficacy, would have increased. It's the phenomena that I have in my other lectures, when I talked about Khatami in Iran, I have referred to as the so-called Gorbachev syndrome. That is, starting to liberalize a society, starting a change, and then losing control of the change process so that you yourself become a victim of change. Therefore, I think what happened in Syria was that the old guard, part of the kind of the oligarchy that was around his father and had allowed for his survival all these years since 1970, for 30 years of survival, those group got to Bashar and convinced him that this cannot last. And if it does, he may very well be overthrown by them. So, unfortunately, after about 8 months, what happened was that Bashar Assad went and restored the status quo ante, and Syria went back to being the same kind of a dictatorship that it was. So initially it started with a lot of hope for liberalized rule, very cautiously, but then once the reception to this and the speculation about this being a very different regime began to gain momentum, the fear of loss of control set in, and they went back to the old regime and system. Next thing I want to talk about is the impact of the 2003 Iraqi invasion on Syria, because this was really the major challenge that confronted the new president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. When President Bush became the president, and after 9/11, when he decided that he has to invade Iraq in order to deal with what he considered to be the sources of the problem with events like 9/11, there really was initial fear on the part of Syrians that if given the swift victory, military victory that Americans experienced in defeating Saddam's army, they felt that they're going to be the next target, especially because President Bush had a very hostile attitude towards Syria. So the Syrian leadership is very much on alert after the invasion of Iraq, and they fear that they are likely to be the next target. And for them, even if Iran had been the next target, that would have deprived them of very important allies. So both Iran and Syria feel very much threatened in the initial phase of the invasion of Iraq. And again, as you can imagine, as I mentioned, it is this strategic need that brings these two regimes together. Not surprisingly, in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, Iran and Syria became closer. As Iraq turned out to be a very different scenario than the one that was imagined by the President Bush, by someone like Vice President Cheney, and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, then suddenly the fear began to be reduced and subside. But now Assad had a different challenge, because as the conflict in Iraq exacerbated the sectarian divide, you have a lot of refugees fleeing Iraq and going to Jordan. Many went to Jordan, but also many went to Syria. So the burden of Iraqi refugee poses new challenges for the Assad's regime. The next important event that impacted and was kind of a shock for Bashar al-Assad's rule occurred in February 2005. What happened was that in Lebanon there was a prime minister by the name of Rafiq Hariri, and he was increasingly trying to free Lebanon from the dominant influence of Syria, because Syria had lots of troops there and they exercised a lot of influence there. And so Hariri was getting a lot of support from the West, from Saudi Arabia, and so he wanted to exercise more influence and become much more independent than the Syrians would have allowed. Therefore, in all likelihood, the regime in Syria decided that this man Hariri is dangerous, so they ended up using their proxies there, assassinating him. So what you have is the assassination of Lebanon's prime minister. There was a powerful bomb blast that killed Hariri and many others. And when that occurred, there was a groundswell of international condemnation, a lot of demonstration in Syria, and in essence, the assassination really backfired. This was followed by a United Nations investigation as to the cause of and the perpetrators for the assassination. There is a wide consensus that the act probably was done by the Hezbollah in conjunction with the Syrian security forces. And so in many ways that has been the modus operandi of the regime to deal with these kinds of challenges. But one of the consequences of this was that a year later, less than a year later, in April 2006, under very intense international pressure, Syria was forced to pull out its troops from Lebanon. These troops were there from April, they really went to Lebanon in April 12, 1976. So you're looking at several years, 30 years of Syrian troops being in Lebanon, and now they had to withdraw. And that was considered a major victory for the Lebanese, other than Hezbollah. and a major defeat for Syria and to a lesser extent Hezbollah in Lebanon. So the Syrian troops' withdrawal from Lebanon became one of those events that showed that Syria is now losing control over a very important kind of a vassal state that they had created in Lebanon. And in some ways, though, in my view, this was a kind of a blessing in disguise, because they already, this would save them money by taking their troops out. It would also make it less internationally embarrassing for them to have the troops there. And so in many ways Syria was already overextended, so probably that shouldn't have damaged, from a strategic point of view, shouldn't have damaged Syria very much. But what it did was it was viewed as a kind of a defeat for Bashar al-Assad. And this pattern pretty much held until the next big event, and the next big event is something you all know, that was in year 2011, the Arab awakening. The Arab awakening reaches Syria in a matter of few months. And one of the things that this teaches us is this, that when it happened originally in Tunisia and in Syria, in Tunisia and in Cairo, a lot of people viewed those two countries as the puppet of the United States. So there was this view that in many ways Arab awakening was a simultaneous call for a kind of a regime, a kind of a government which would be independent of its close relationship, almost vassal-like relationship, dependent relationship with the United States. So Assad really felt that this would not happen in Syria, because Syria was an independent state, wasn't a puppet of anybody. And this shows that the Arab awakening, the fact that it occurred also in Syria, the contagion went there, was not at all limited to the U.S. so-called puppets, but it also was directed against states like Syria. So it became quickly obvious that this could really become a very serious challenge to the rule of this dynasty that had dominated politics of Syria for over 4 decades. The protest movement in Syria, therefore, was inspired in large part by the success of these protests in Tunisia and in Egypt. And like Tunisia and Egypt, in Syria, it also began in a relatively small scale demonstration, but then in its early phase, it was one in which that it quickly began to spread out. Actually, the beginning of it was very similar to both Tunisia and Cairo. It took a particular incident to spark and to ignite the protest movement there in Syria. And that happened in February, but very quickly in March 16, what happened was there was another incident, and this particular one became really the rallying cry for the masses. On March 16, 2011, there were 15 young school children who were arrested in the southern Syrian city of Daraa. The boys ranged in age between 10 to 15, and their crime was that they had painted a graffiti The graffiti was something they had seen, was a slogan they had seen on television during the Arab uprising in Tunis and in Cairo. So they painted the slogans, and the slogan simply said this, quote, "The people want to topple the system." The word system in Arabic is nizam. They did not specifically mention Bashar al-Assad. They said the people want to topple the system. So the regime decided that the best way to handle this is to make an example of these people. So they were taken to a local security branch of the intelligence, and in the course of the interrogation, the children were beaten, they were burnt, and their fingernails were pulled out. So this was a very brutal way to deal with this, and as you can imagine, it completely backfired. In response to this brutality, on March 15, the day was renamed as, or was designated as, the Day of Rage. Some 200 people, very brave people, went out in Damascus and demonstrated. The demonstration was like the other demonstration in other parts of the Arab world that had experienced the Arab uprising. It was essentially a pro-democracy against the regime, but it was a pro-democracy uprising or demonstration. The demonstrators demanded reform of the system and also the ouster of President Bashar al-Assad. The protest movement very rapidly, actually, with these 200, gained momentum. And after the Friday prayer on March 18, you had 10 days of protest continuing. And these were 10 days of anti-government protests gaining in momentum, and the regime decided to act. Some 60 people were killed between March 18 to March 28. So in that 10 days, some 60 people were killed. So with that event, what happened was that the protest movement now continued, and it was getting worse by the day. Then on the 30th of March, Bashar gave a speech that was much anticipated. The idea was that he may even announce some major changes or possibly a reshaping of his government and so on. There was much anticipation about his speech, but the actual speech showed that Assad had remained completely defiant, made no concession, and as a result, what happened was the unrest and crackdown began to increase. In April of 2011, and there was a kind of a concession made on April 19. This was the repeal of the very old emergency law that was in place until it was in place in 1963, but it was repealed in April 19, 2011, but it was meaningless because all the emergency measures that was authorized with that emergency law was still in place. It didn't make any difference. So this was a kind of a symbolic gesture without having much meaning. Next, what we get is, after some 15 months of a conflict, which now morphed into an armed conflict, the regime began to really unleash a very, very brutal crackdown on the protesters and on the civilians, using lots of ammunition and bombardments and airplanes So by the time 15 months later comes, we have close to 9,000 people that are dead, and one of the cities known as Homs replaces Hama as remember the 1982 massacre we mentioned, as the killing field in Syria.